obviously someone who originates from Northern Ireland originally, you take a very keen interest in precisely what went on with the protocol and what has been now proposed with the Westminster framework, with the Windsor framework, I should say. Just first of all, I'm very interested to see what your first impressions were to the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday.
Well, Tom, I actually live full-time in Northern Ireland. Now I have done since I gave up being a Member of Parliament, so I'm very interested. It's my home. Now, the reality is that Rishi Sunak made a very optimistic, upbeat speech, which if you read it and listened to him, you'd have thought, wonderful, everything's solved, it's marvellous. The DUP will be running back into the Stormont tomorrow. The reality is, there are a lot of documents to do with his speech. There's a lot of detail. The most interesting one, and I've read a lot of things now about it, but not everything I can say, but the EU document that came out is the most interesting, because practically everything that Rishi said, then you look at what the EU are saying, and of course it's quite different. Sometimes similar, but usually different, with a very clear interpretation of the fact that the EU law and EU justice courts and EU generally are still in charge. So I think, first of all, the Prime Minister, I welcome that he's allowing and saying there'll be a lot of time for people to read it properly. But of course, in the end, even if the DUP oppose it, it will go through Parliament because Labour is supporting it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the executive will come back, or that President Biden will get his visit, which is what an awful lot of this rush is about. President Biden wants to come in April, and he can't come if the Northern Ireland executive's not sitting, because that would show the Belfast Agreement was broken.
Which is fascinating, because it does seem that this was all done. Number 10 has denied for the last few months that they were working to any sort of deadline. But behind the scenes, it does seem that the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement has been some sort of informal deadline in all of this. What effect do you think that that's had on the talks?
Oh, I think without a doubt the Irish government have been chasing and pushing quite a lot, and have been a little bit, I would say, more flexible recently, because they are desperate to get President Biden there too. But also behind the scene, the Americans, don't underestimate the influence of American officials in America on our foreign service and on wanting to have this visit. And of course, I'm sure Rishi Sunak would like to have it as well. So it's definitely been there. There's been that push to get something. And I just think anyone who reads it will realise that sometimes I think Downing Street and people advising the Prime Minister don't really understand Northern Ireland. And a lot of members of Parliament, I'm afraid, only take an interest in Northern Ireland when something like this is happening. And I think if they knew what was really going on, they would see that for 2 or 3 years now, people have been speaking out about the protocol, saying all the things now that Rishi Sunak is saying has been broken about it. We've been saying that for months and months and months, and now we've got something that he is saying is wonderful and is really ensuring Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. It doesn't actually come out like that when you read the documents. However, the DUP will look at it, everyone is going to examine it, and we will just going to have to wait and see. But every day I think we'll find something new that is not quite what Rishi Sunak said.
You speak a lot to the people in the DUP, and I just wonder if even if everything about this deal isn't perfect, if there is compromise made within it, certainly the EU has moved on its original positions. There were some things the EU said were impossible a few years ago that are now certainly part of this deal. I wonder if you think that after all of these years of wrangling backwards and forwards, there is perhaps room now for a greater degree of compromise.
Well, of course, the DUP have been out of government now. There's been no executive for nearly a year. Sinn Féin, don't let's forget, brought down the executive for 3 years, and I didn't see Westminster MPs up in arms and calling on Sinn Féin, to come back. So there is a bit of double standards here when it comes to what unionism does and what Sinn Féin does, because of course unionism hasn't been linked to paramilitary terrorism. However, I think the DUP will look carefully. Remember, they have a mandate. They have a very clear mandate at the election at the last election not to go back into government until the 7 tests were met. And if you look at the 7 tests, the one question I asked yesterday in our statement in the House of Lords was about the Acts of Union, because the Prime Minister has said that is very, very important. And I said, well, where is the legal text now that is going to go back on what the Supreme Court itself said, that the Acts of Union had been subjugated, and therefore I want to know where that legal text is that we're going to be back as an integral part of the United Kingdom. And unless that happens, that is a hugely important test of the DUP. And then we look at something like the green lanes, which have been said is wonderful now. The reality is that everything that still comes is going to have paperwork, is going to have to still do quite a lot of bureaucracy. It's not a green lane. If it was a real green lane, we wouldn't need a green lane. And the idea that somebody trading from Birmingham to Bristol and then Birmingham to Belfast has to go through huge extra bureaucracy. Not as bad maybe as it was, and there won't be so many checks, but it's not just about the checks. And it's it may sound little things like that, but those are the details that actually affect everyday lives, and that's what the DUP will be thinking about.
It'll be fascinating over the next, perhaps, 2 weeks, how many of those details bubble up to the surface. But for now, Kate Hoey, thank you so much for joining us there on College Green outside Westminster.